the newspaper, your TV, and you see diplomacy in action. You're used to seeing foreign ministers. You're used to seeing heads of state meeting. You're used to seeing these big grand summits, handshakes, group photos, family photos. But where is the public in this diplomacy? Now, here to talk more about this topic is the professor of public diplomacy at Kyoto University of Foreign Studies, Nancy Snow.
Thank you so much, and I'm delighted to be here. Konbanwa from Tokyo, Japan. I want to thank the organizers. I'm very excited about the international nature of this strategic communications summit. And since I have just brief remarks to share, and hopefully there'll be an opportunity for a little Q&A after, I wanted to just give a case study, a little comparative case study of what happened over the last year. As everybody knows, Tokyo and Japan came under a greater spotlight than many other parts of the world. It was dealing with the postponed Olympics as well as an ongoing pandemic. And Japan had been relatively unscathed, relatively speaking, in terms of mortality by COVID-19. But as we know, by 2021, there were new state of emergency alerts, just as the government was on its final push to hold the Olympics. And so I want to take you all back to the winter of 2021 and tell a bit of a story that will show a tale of two prime ministers, if you will, one a former prime minister, and then the current prime minister of Japan, Kishida. I'm a strong advocate for putting more of the public into public diplomacy and not taking the public for granted. And by public, I mean the public sphere, public opinion, the citizen who is part of the polis, and that citizen's relationship with public servants, also known as politicians. So I often advocate for leadership, holding responsible leadership accountable. And the way that we hold responsible leadership accountable is through the public speaking back to the government. So reputation as it relates to strategic communication is so important, and it's a dynamic concept, as we all know. It can go up and down, whether it applies to a person, a place, or even a nation state like Japan. Japan is fortunate because as a soft power, it's a bit of a superpower for its cultural prowess. There are so many people around the world who are Japan curious, who have a real desire over their lifetime to at least one time visit Japan, to learn about a place that so elegantly melds traditional and modern culture. What's less known is politics. Occasionally, though, people hear about the very notorious gender gap in Japan. For the world's third largest economy, that's always a statistic that makes headlines. So on February 3rd, 2021, during a meeting of the Tokyo 2020 Organizing Committee, the president of that committee, who is a former prime minister, Yoshiro Mori, was asked about a new policy related to increasing the number of women on the Olympic Organizing Committee, and to increase female representation on the board, I believe, to about 40%. His words in response were, quote, the translation was, if we increase the number of female board members, we have to make sure their speaking time is restricted somewhat. They have difficulty finishing, which is annoying. And he added, we already have about 7 women at the Tokyo Organizing Committee, but everyone understands their place. These quotes were quickly the quotes that sort of went around the world. And within 24 hours, Mori, as president, had to do what is perfunctory, what is expected in Japan, which is he made an apology. He publicly apologized. That's standard operating procedure here. And it's so expected that it's almost ignored. He said that his comments were inappropriate and were contrary to the spirit of the Olympics and Paralympics. But he stopped short of resigning over his remarks. He claimed at that time that he did think about resigning. He sort of talked out loud as to what he was thinking. And he said, though, that he decided not to resign because the most important thing is how to make the Tokyo Olympics successful. Prime Minister Suga at that time said that Mori's remarks were, quote, not good for the national interest. But then Suga faltered by agreeing with putting the Olympics above a growing outraged public sentiment. And this included what became just an outpouring of response. The Olympic Organizing Committee handled immediately over 4,550 phone complaints. Female members of the opposition party in Japan's Diet, the parliament, started wearing white clothing to symbolize the women's suffrage movement. Human Rights Watch offered Mori a gold medal in female discrimination. Japanese tennis superstar Naomi Osaka, who would go on to light the Olympic cauldron, weighed in herself, and she said, I think if you're in a position like that, you really should think before you say anything. I don't know in what situation he said those things, but I think it's really uninformed and a bit ignorant. All of this took place against a backdrop of Japan's dismally low-ranking position, as I mentioned earlier, a ranking of 121 out of 153 nations, where being number 1 is to have the narrowest gender gap. And this is according to the 2020 Global Gender Gap Report by the World Economic Forum. The outcome, as we know, was preordained. Mori had to resign, and he was replaced swiftly by the female Olympian Seiko Hashimoto, who went on to become the face of the Olympic Games as far as handling the official communications. Now, the moral of this story to a strategic communication interested audience is a nod to George Bernard Shaw, who said the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. Indeed, Mori thought he had communicated when he apologized. He thought he had communicated when he said he thought about resigning. And he also thought he had communicated when he said, after thinking it over, I'm going to prioritize holding a successful Olympics. This crisis dragged on for over a week, an eternity in a global communications life cycle. The delay was a blow to Japan's public diplomacy and soft power reputation. The biggest failure in the case of Japan, we talk about reading the air, that you read the room, that you understand, you're perceptive, you observe. The biggest failure to read the air here was that the Japanese public was already weary of the ongoing pandemic, was weary over the slow vaccine rollout, and hints was largely opposed to even holding the Olympic Games. Maury's elevating the success of the Olympics over public concern doomed his tenure, and he had to step down. In this case, the public led the rebalancing of diplomacy. Strategic communication for us is an ideal concept. It refers to planned, calculated, deliberate communication. Its opposite is randomness, unplanned, accidental, chaotic communication. But how often do we really reach our planned communications capacities? We have to anticipate that what could go wrong will go wrong. The American author John Steinbeck, in his 1937 novel of Mice and Men, which is the title and the theme was inspired by Robert Burns, the poet. That book revolves around the theme that despite the best laid schemes we design and create, how we try to outsmart people, how we try to plan things out, things will often go unplanned. The result will be you can't catch the mouse and you can't satisfy everybody in the public, or you can't satisfy members of the foreign press. You have to be ever adapting to ever changing obstacles and be timely about it. So I wanted to share with you a bit of a success story in contrast. The current prime minister, very new, he's been around a long time. He's a very seasoned politician, an acolyte, very close to Shinzo Abe. But Prime Minister Kishida in the last month was confronted by a real turnaround in terms of crisis communications management. On November 29th, he made a swift decision to close the country's borders due to the unknown surrounding the Omicron variant. He told reporters at that time, quote, "I am ready to face criticism that I am being too cautious." And this was just 3 weeks after Japan had eased its ban on foreign entry after 18 months of having borders closed. So what do you suppose happened to Kishida's popularity among the Japanese people? You might expect that it would go down, but in fact, his favorability numbers went up. Now, I attribute that to his confident and, yes, overly cautious position. You could criticize maybe taking that extra cautious position, but the way that he delivered the message with confidence and resolve was very well received by the people here. He explained why he was taking such a strong stance. He said, when dealing with an unknown risk, it's best to take every precaution. A worst case scenario drove this strict measure. And in addition, his border announcement occurred in the context of a record 36 trillion yen, approximately 314 billion US dollars, supplementary budget for fiscal 2021 to fund an economic stimulus package for the pandemic afflicted businesses and people in Japan. This, for the new prime minister, along with calling for a person-driven, a more personal approach to diplomacy, and a more humane-driven capitalism with more public-private partnership and entrepreneurialism, this helped him to hold on to public support. And I don't know how long that public support will be there, but so far, it's an interesting contrasting case between these two. It tells me in this new administration, it has looked back on the previous administration. Suga was only in office as prime minister for a year, and also with the handling of the postponed Olympics. And the new administration has learned from some of the mistakes made then. So in the second case, leadership at the top drove diplomacy to the public. So it was a case of leadership reaching down to the public and the public accepting the hand of the leadership. Kishida wisely chose his remarks carefully to anticipate negative public sentiment. And by doing so, he gained support for his swift resolve in the face of uncertainty. So I wanted to share those two cases with you just as sort of a kicking off point about strategic communication. I'm a bit of a, yes, I've been an academic for almost 30 years, but when it comes to communication, I'm always about the fundamentals and about what are you communicating? How effective is it? You have to measure it, you have to do research, but you also have to have the appropriate engagement and people skills. And of course, it's more challenging now online. I'm not with you all today because of the new border situation here and the Omicron. It makes it very difficult to travel for me right now out of Japan. But nevertheless, I'm here to engage with the audience the best we can. And I would like to welcome a question either from the moderator or from the audience, or even more than one question about how we can learn from each other in terms of these fundamentals of communication, which begin with listening, paying attention, reading the room, and looking for those cues that are so fundamental as to how people are taking in the information, how they're receiving that information. So let me just stop there and open it up.
Thank you, Professor Snow. And I personally want to benefit from your experience. And I kind of want to ask you a little bit of a controversial question now. With so many channels opened up, whether it be social media, whether it be Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and it's becoming easier and easier for governments to interact with foreign publics. Where do we draw the line between public diplomacy and foreign intervention? Because foreign intervention is a word we're hearing a lot. We're hearing it from the United States, whether it be the Russiagate scandal. We're hearing it in other countries. We heard it during Brexit. What is the line that should not be crossed when governments are trying to talk with foreign publics? We're seeing a lot of governments trying to reach out to groups that are labeled as opposition in other countries, and also groups that are controversial as well, and providing support for them. So I know you talked a lot about the way public diplomacy is proactive, but there's also ways that public diplomacy can serve in a destructive or disruptive role as well. And I'd like to hear what your red line would be, and how other countries should react or view this type of behavior.
Well, I would invite everybody. I think we don't really have a guidebook yet, do we? I mean, we're working on that. I'm on the editorial board, and I've written an article again about Japan for the Defense Strategic Communications Journal. So we have these centers of excellence in Stratcom. We also, as you say, we have governments and their leadership talking about intervention. When I hear foreign intervention as a US citizen, I often think of it in a military context, not always in a communication context. But I think we're in the Wild West days right now, aren't we? And I was very moved by this year's Nobel Peace Prize laureates, the co-winners. And actually, I have to mention Maria Ressa because I met her at, of all places, the headquarters of Facebook. And I was there in March of 2019, along with a very small group of academics who were there to assess what at that time Facebook, now Meta, needed to hear about countering the worst aspects of propaganda and misinformation and disinformation. Do you think we came to any real conclusion over a few days? We didn't. If anything, we raised a lot more questions. And now, if you listen to Ressa, a big reason for her receiving this award had to do with her being so outspoken against Facebook, but also these gigantic monopolies that are driving so much information, that have so much power, that the public, we can't even wrap our minds around the kind of influence these organizations have. So, I mean, I don't have a red line, but I come out of having worked for the public sector, mostly in the academic sector. I believe there are good people in every government who should be thinking about these things regularly, not maybe losing sleep over it, but it should be of concern. And they have to engage their own national publics over this. I think it would be harder somewhat to make it an international movement. I suppose, though, if I were just thinking right here off the cuff, you could meld it to a sustainability goal. Because here in Japan, my students really embrace the UN Sustainability Development Goals. And there really isn't one so much. There's one on education and on, water. And we really maybe should view the global information environment really as part of the environmental movement. And I say that as somebody who worked very closely with George Gerbner, who was the dean of the UPenn Annenberg School for 25 years. And back in the 80s and early 90s, we worked on what we called the cultural environment movement then. And it had a lot to do with increasing representation, really telling authentic stories in the media, but also recognizing that there were a lot of companies and organizations that were really distanced from the public and were not being held accountable, commercial media, for instance. And so we had that legacy there, but we've never really seen that grow into a movement comparable to what we see with the climate change movement. And, we're talking here about climate of the mind. And so in my work on public diplomacy along the spectrum with propaganda studies, we're really battling. We're figuring out ways to hold ourselves accountable, to hold others accountable, to also make sense of what comes across the screen. I heard it mentioned just a few minutes ago about the visual impact of information. There's no question about it, that the TikTok generation now, they're very moved by visuals and by entertaining visuals and things that make them laugh, things that are shareable. And for us oldsters, and I include myself in that, we haven't always picked up on that to understand how can we communicate these accountability messages, these
Professor,
countering the worst aspects of information.
Professor, I want to cut you off. I want to cut you off and ask you one more question. We're running out of time. I want a 2-minute answer. You said in your comments that you named the big 3 social media companies, and you said that they have so much power. Do they have too much power?
Oh, yeah, that's pretty much yes, of course. I mean, I'm not alone there. I think we all. What's that?
Does it need to be limited? Does government have to begin controlling or at least setting very specific parameters in the social media sector?
Well, it's not just me, but the public at large has said these companies are too large. They're out of reach. And that the people at the top sort of they become godlike figures. And yet they aren't really lighting the way any better than the rest of us. So they should be broken up. They're monopolies. I mean, there's no, and yet we're still beholden to them. I'm still on Facebook Meta. I'm still on Twitter. I use Google all the time. but you're so dependent on it. At the same time, you need to question, though, why they've become so large. There was a time, pre all of these entities, where I think we were communicating with a sense of more ethical responsibility. And just look at Zuckerberg when he went before Congress. A lot of kind of deer in the headlights looks at the members of Congress, not holding his own company accountable to the public.
Well, definitely people who do think they are above the international order. Hopefully, governments will find a way to be able to rein in this unrestricted power that they do have, and hopefully social media could be an area for healthy information environment going forward. Professor Snow, thank you very much for joining us today.
You're very welcome. Thank you.